Hello and welcome to FO Live, as we ask what are the paths towards peace in Yemen. Today's event is brought to you by Fair Observer in association with Dejuan podcast. Today we're joined by a panel of eminent Yemenis to discuss the conflict in that country, which has been raging since March 2015, and the possible paths towards its resolution. Khaled Hussein Al-Yamani is the country's former ambassador to the United Nations and Yemen's former Minister of Foreign Affairs. Munir Saeed is a retired businessman and political activist who co-founded the TAWQ, which is a Yemeni non-partisan political movement. Sama Al-Hamdani is a Yemeni analyst and media commentator. She's the director of Yemen's Cultural Institute for Heritage and the Arts. And Nawal Al-Maghafi is the BBC's special correspondent and an award-winning filmmaker. So welcome to you all today. We see an escalation across the war fronts and in narratives across social media and media outlets. Are political actors and their constituencies ready to sit at the peace table? And Mr. Yamani, if I can go to you first on that, because you did mention that the actors are too focused on this zero-sum game. If you can expand a little on that.
And every time I was talking about peace, people say, this is idealistic approach. We will defeat them. And they kept saying, we need another week, we need another month, and we will defeat them, and we will push back. Look what's happening in Marib. It's a real carnage. Thousands of corpses are scattered on that mountains. Why? It's all the war for power.
I think that it's natural in peace processes, right before warring parties sit at the table, they try to expand as much as they can and get as much territory on the ground before they sit at the table. I think this time, again, there's a huge miscalculation. But as long as there is profit in war, there will always be people who are interested in continuing the war. And I think the first step to preparing people to be at the negotiating table is to dry out outside funds to these local parties. And that is very possible to do in the next upcoming months.
We're going to go to a question here from Atul Singh, who's the editor-in-chief of Fair Observer. He asks, can there be peace without involving Iran in the talks?
No doubt that the forces in Yemen which are fighting are receiving everything they use in this war from external forces. Whether it is Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, we need to get them to stop supporting theirs, to start sponsoring their own allies within the country. We can always talk and say Iran and Houthi or Iran and Ansarullah, but there are also others who are equally being supported by regional players.
Yes, we need to cut outside support to the war elements in Yemen, but no one is listening because there is no interest. Yemenis, for centuries, they are expert in waging wars of proxies. And we need to end that to live in peace in our country.
Just a question really about recent events. So there was a donors meeting just last week in terms of donating money to Yemen, which was short of $1 billion. Perhaps, Nawal, you're able to comment on this one, which is really what will be the impact, the humanitarian impact of that decision?
It really is devastating. I mean, when we were making this film, a huge part of it was the impact that aid cuts were already having in Yemen. And we visited one of the biggest things that impacted the COVID response was that 10,000 doctors had stopped receiving this WHO supplement that they'd been receiving since this war began. Because they aren't receiving government salaries, doctors in Yemen are relying on these WHO supplements that they get on a monthly basis, and aid cuts mean they're not receiving it anymore. We went to malnutrition clinics, which have had their funding cut. Now, children, we see a lot of pictures of malnourished children in Yemen. Now for a child to receive treatment, they have to make their own way to one of these clinics. And as soon as they leave, they receive no support whatsoever.
It is not about giving aid to Yemen. It is about compensating Yemen. And because that is different. Aid comes from the generosity of your heart. You have no obligation to give it. And if you give it, you can lay any conditions you want. And we have seen this disaster only a few days ago with the United Nations asking for $4 billion and getting less than $2 billion. And that $4 billion is nothing compared to what Yemen requires in terms of rebuilding.
Just to touch on what you mentioned, which was rebuilding the nation, we've had a question from Angela Dejuan who's asking, what would peace in Yemen actually look like, bearing in mind there was a lot of conflict even before this war, and there were various groups. How on earth would peace look in reality? Is it realistic?
We need to agree on the format. And in that format, we have the national dialogue outcome, which we discuss it together. I think the Houthis agree on like 90% of that document. Some say that no, they are not agreeing on the federal structure. They are not agreeing on that, on this. But we have an agreement. We have an agreement with the Houthis. We don't want to let the Houthis go into kidnapping the entire nation, deciding the fate of a nation through war and bloody confrontation.
So to imagine that the war would end and that a restoration of democratic practices would just occur in Yemen is very unrealistic, and we have to phase them in and prepare the population. So before we talk about how the rule of law would occur in Yemen, I think we need to elevate and take the pressure off Yemenis who have had to suffer without food and water and access to healthcare. We have to ease them into restoring their dignity and restoring faith in them as civilians and citizens, and then we have a responsibility to make sure that the path continues in the right direction.
What is important is that we Yemenis must be prepared to discuss everything and put everything on the table without preconditions. No ceilings, no floors. Everything is possible on the table, because at the end of the day, ending the war and finding peace and finding coexistence between the various ethnicities of Yemenis in one country. Yemen is a large country with different people. Finding the formula to coexist together as a country is what is primary, and not the structure of government. But centralized government is out of question.
Cessation of hostilities, as everybody can agree, we need to stop this war, and next will be talking the talk and look how we can manage to live together again.
Okay. Unfortunately, a whole hour has passed and we've barely scratched the surface. Clearly, we need the whole day to talk about this topic. If we can just have maybe just a very short concluding remark from each of you, I'd like you to think about what's the one thing that needs to happen to enable a path to peace to even be possible.
Get the external players out of Yemen's affairs. Let Yemenis sit around the table themselves. We have had many wars in the past. They have not lasted more than a few weeks. We sat around the table. We didn't get the 100% solution, but we got a solution. Now, the only wars that lasted as long as this did are the ones where external players were directly involved.
Okay.
That's what is required.
Thank you. Thank you, Munir.
I'm going to reiterate what Mr. Munir said. The external players, as soon as they pull out of this war, there will be many less Yemenis with power who are making too much money from this conflict and have too much personal interest to keep this conflict going. And we've been saying this for the last 6 years. Had it happened 6 years ago, the Houthis would have a much less power right now that we're trying to take off them. And many Yemenis wouldn't be starving, wouldn't have had their houses bombed in the process. But it's never too late. But the first step has to be for the external powers to stop their involvement.
We need to focus on the international level, the regional level, but the local, the national level is the most complicated. After 6 years of war, now we are entering 7 years of war. And if we miss this opportunity, we will end up having 10 years, 15 years of war, and no one will take care of their many concerns, because Somalia next door was an example, vivid example of what happened.
The whole terming it as Houthis is giving this war a sectarian image, which it doesn't have. This war is about politics, about power struggle, about different factions in Yemen. Each one of them wants to rule Yemen. That's what this war is all about. And therefore, we have to change the narrative in order to be able to identify the real problem of this war and be able to solve it.
So I just want to say thank you so much for everyone who attended today. It's been absolutely amazing to hear all your questions, all your comments, and to see how passionate everybody is. You can continue the conversation at Fair Observer. You can sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to our channel, follow us on social media, and of course you can publish with us as well. So please do join us and become a Fair Observer. Thank you very much.